the conceit of the West is that it's transcended Christianity to become purely universal, purely global. But its values, its assumptions, its ethics remain palpably bred of the marrow of Christianity. We've been able to get away with this conceit for as long as we have done because we're the products of societies that for 200 or 300 years have been globally hegemonic. But as that ends, as the West's economic, financial, military, cultural power recedes, so I think our ability to assume that our values, our assumptions are universal will go into retreat as well.
Hello there, welcome to Re-Enchanting, the podcast from Seen and Unseen. Here at Lambeth Palace Library, we actually record in this amazing venue where we get to look out over Parliament. It's just the most amazing place to be able to record. It's part of the Centre for Cultural Witness. You can find us at the website seenandunseen.com. I am Justin Brierley.
And I am Belle Tindall.
And we are so pleased today to be joined by Tom Holland, who we will introduce in just a moment's time. But you've got a bit to say about Tom, first of all, Belle.
A bit to say, yes. Well, Tom is an award-winning historian, author, broadcaster. I think we might be verging on national treasure territory, personally. I don't know how you feel about that. But
Does that officially get bestowed on someone? Is it like being knighted, being named a national treasure? I don't know.
I don't know.
Guys, don't embarrass yourselves. But more importantly, don't embarrass me.
And of course, the co-host of the beloved podcast, The Rest is History.
Absolutely.
Author of Rubicon, Persian Fire, and the mighty, and it is mighty in every sense of the word, Dominion.
Yes, we'd talk about that, the book that charts how the Christian Revolution shaped the modern world. And in a sense, your own journey, Tom, of realising that despite our increasingly post-Christian culture, we are still very much products of that Christian revolution. So really looking forward to talking to you today on the Re-Enchanting podcast about re-enchanting history. And we'll also mention the coronation, which is coming up very soon as well. But welcome along to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for inviting me to this incredible venue.
It's not bad, is it?
I don't know where you record your podcast, Tom, but this...
It's not quite as impressive as this.
Well, anyway. It's a very suitable location, actually, given that we're talking about empire and Christendom and coronations to have, Westminster Abbey just behind us.
So and just down from Lambeth Palace.
Yes,
so,
absolutely. Yeah, it literally in the back garden of Lambeth Palace here. This podcast, though, is recorded at the top of Lambeth Palace Library, so we always start with our guests asking, well, what are you reading at the moment? What's on your bedside table, Tom?
You mentioned the history podcast I do, The Rest is History, and I'm in the midst of researching a series of episodes on the 100 Years' War, which I was obsessed by when I was about 12, I should think, and I read everything about it, and I haven't really read much about it since. So it's kind of one of the things where I'm dusting down a childhood obsession.
Great.
So I am halfway through the second volume in Jonathan Sumption's enormous, comprehensive, exhaustive history of the 100 Years' War, and I am just approaching the Battle of Poitiers, when the Black Prince not only defeats the French king, but takes him prisoner.
Is it nice that, I mean, does that feel like you're reading kind of for work purposes, or is it also for pleasure?
It's absolutely for both. I'd been really wanting to do the 100 Years' War pretty much since we started doing the podcast, but I've been so busy with other projects that I knew the reason I wanted to do it was I wanted to have the excuse to immerse myself in all the reading. So I've been saving it up until I had kind of 2 or 3 weeks spare to really...
I think the 2 or 3 weeks measure you just gave us surprise a lot of our listeners. Just 2 or 3 weeks
to get through the whole.
To get through a very exhausting.
Well, normally, I mean, we did the French Revolution in 50 minutes, and I think I did about 10 minutes research on Wikipedia for that. So we're becoming more professional.
There you go.
I know the art of blagging and bluffing your way through the odd podcast, Tom. So anything else on your bedside table at the moment?
Well, it's not on my bedside table. It's on it's on a Kindle that I haven't yet downloaded, and it's a book that has been written. It's the first draft of a book by a cricketing friend, Michael Taylor, who has written a history of the discovery of dinosaurs.
Oh, amazing.
Two of your favourite subjects
Yeah.
in one.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. So once I finish off the Black Prince, I'll be moving on to Megalosaurus.
There you go.
Yeah. Speaking of the rest is history, and we'll start there because I think that'll be if people are listening to this podcast, and they're obviously podcast fans, so that might be, where they sort of encounter you the most. It's the most popular history podcast in the world.
I think it is. I think it's got a claim
very
to
happy
that.
to go with that.
Should we just
let's just
stick our
assume.
flag in the sand
Yeah,
with that one?
Yeah,
There you go.
okay, I'm not going to dispute it.
Yeah, there we go. Blame me. What is it about that podcast that you think people are so drawn to? And you can put modesty down for a moment.
Yeah.
I think it's probably the dynamic between
Sure.
me and Dominic.
Sure.
So my co-host Dominic Sandbrook is, he kind of takes on the persona of the bluff voice of Middle England.
Yeah.
And I very much have the persona of a kind of epicene metropolitan
So
wig.
That's
Dominic's
the way.
tucking into roast beef,
Right,
and
I
I'm
see.
kind of toying with
Yes.
a French ragout. is very much, those are the kind of stereotypes that we conform to. So I think probably that.
And you've known each other a long time, right?
Yeah, so we about 20 years ago shared a publisher,
Yeah.
and we met on a literary quiz,
Okay.
and we found that we had very similar interests.
This is probably before you even heard the word podcast, but
Absolutely.
yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, and the thing is, I was more au fait with podcasts than Dominic was, because he lives in Hobbiton. They don't have podcasts in Hobbiton.
No.
Well, it has just been amazing to see the way it's just absolutely exploded into public consciousness. It's I know people all over the world who listen to it, and I suppose what's the secret, apart from the chemistry, obviously, between you and Dominic, that when it comes to these subjects, which a lot of people might think can be somewhat dry, or the things I learned at school.
But they're not.
Why,
I mean, that's the thing.
Why do they come
That's the
alive
thing.
in your hands?
Well, I think maybe just because as you all know, the key to doing podcasts is to talk about things that interest you. There's no point in doing it otherwise. And I guess that sharing an interest is one of the most enjoyable things that you can do.
Yeah.
And I think that there's no aspect of history that isn't fascinating. And maybe we convey a sense of that, of just how fascinating all kinds of things are. So, I mean, we always find that the most popular episodes are the ones that you would expect. They're the kind of the bangers.
The sort of rise of Hitler type episode.
Rise of the Nazis, Julius Caesar, all that kind of thing. But so often it's the episodes where people are surprised, I think, by how interesting a topic can be. And the notorious example of that is an episode we did on pigeons and the role that pigeons have played in history, which I went to a carol service and met Gordon. I was sitting next to Gordon Carrera, who'd been listening to the podcast.
Yeah.
And Gordon Carrera is the BBC security correspondent. And he said that he'd written a book on the role played by pigeons in the First and Second World War, because they were used by intelligence services. So it's very much his field. And he would love to come on and talk about pigeons. And I was immediately smitten by the idea. Because, of course, pigeons basically are doves. So, we're here in Lambeth Palace. Doves have an important role to play in the Bible, in Greek and Roman culture, all kinds of things, as well as the role that they played in war. And of course, there's the terrible narrative of the passenger pigeon, which great flocks flew over America, billions of them, and they'd all been kind of shot, and now they're completely extinct. So it did actually touch on all kinds of interesting aspects of history. Yeah. But I began floating it as an idea to people on the podcast. We'll be doing this episode on pigeons, and people thought that I was joking.
Yeah.
And it became this kind of mythical thing that was approaching, and then finally we did it. And so I'm very proud that we do the Rise of the Nazis and we do pigeons.
Yeah.
Absolutely. You grew up going to church, but you say that in your own life, the dimmer switch on faith got sort of turned down at an early age. Why was that? What happened?
It was kind of in my early teens. I I never kind of, I never had a great crisis of faith where I started, in a Byronic manner, railing at God or thinking that religion was evil or anything like that. I never went the full Christopher Hitchens, but equally, I think I found other things more exciting and glamorous, and it was really the kind of the blaze of, say, in my childhood, the blaze of the Greek gods. I found them much more charismatic and exciting, and I just kind of ended up not particularly interested in Christianity, I guess. But having said that, I did absolutely retain an interest in the dimension of the supernatural, because when I left university, my ambition was to become a great novelist. I wanted to be Proust, very modest ambition. But it turned out that I lacked the capabilities to be Proust. And so instead, I was doing a doctorate on Byron and not really enjoying it, and feeling that that Byron was a subject that was ill-suited to an academic approach. And I actually feel that about quite a lot of things that academics study, that often an academic approach can kind of kill the subject dead. But it struck me that Byron was the model for how most of us now think of the vampire, that he became the hero of the first kind of mass market vampire story that was a product of the same Summer Without a Winter that saw Mary Shelley come up with the idea for Frankenstein. And so I wrote a novel in which Byron literally was a vampire.
Yes.
And it told the story of his life, making kind of sense of various enigmatic episodes in his life and explaining it through the prism of vampirism, which I thought was actually very convincing.
Yeah.
And so I found myself locked into a contract that required me to write 3 more vampire novels. Okay. And it had never been part of my life plan to be a vampire novelist. But all the vampire novels I wrote were set in specific periods of history. Yes. And it was, the premise was basically taking the beliefs, the supernatural beliefs of a particular period in time and interpreting through the prism of vampirism,
Wow.
Which was actually quite a good discipline for what I then went on to do, which was to write history without vampires. Because I'd realised, even as I was writing, I was much more interested in the history than I was in...
History could still be interesting without vampires.
Well, history was actually much more interesting without vampires, what I came to realise, that, truth is stranger than fiction. That's what Byron said. Yeah. And so when I then came to write a book about the Romans, Rubicon, you mentioned it, and then a book about Greeks and the Persians and so on. And I took into writing about those periods of history a sense that the supernatural really mattered, and that to adopt a kind of sneery, superior, purely materialist approach to the beliefs of ancient peoples was, I mean, it wasn't just that it was unjustified, but that it risked seriously and grievously misinterpreting what ancient peoples were doing and why they were doing it. And so that led me inexorably to an interest in Christianity, because the more I thought about, say, what the Romans or the Athenians thought, believed, how they ordered their lives, how they structured their government, their perspectives on the entire fabric of things seen and unseen, I came to realize that my ability to understand them was being obstructed basically by my Christian assumptions, that I was seeing through a glass darkly, if you like, and that the glass was dark. The darkness in the glass was a Christian darkness.
It was the filter through which you were looking.
Exactly. And the challenge was to, if I was to try and make sense of the pre-Christian world, was to try and filter that out. But to do that, I had to recognize and appreciate what it was about the filter that was Christian.
Just for anyone who was yet to read Dominion in particular, and of course those people will be going on to read it straight after this
I hope so.
podcast ends.
Inshallah.
Yeah, can you tell us a little bit, and how do you squeeze such a mighty book into this answer? Tell us a little bit about what Dominion's main argument, what's the thread that runs through Dominion? What did you find in Rubicon and in Persian Fire? And then how did that feed into what Dominion is saying?
the cliche that I parade when asked this question.
Yes,
and,
please. Cliche away.
I know that Justin certainly will have heard me say this a million times and will probably start gnawing his leg off as I say it again. But the core thesis is that we are goldfish swimming in Christian waters.
Okay.
And we don't recognize that we are in a goldfish bowl. And we in the West tend to assume that things that are actually very culturally contingent, a product of the 2,000 years of the Christian Revolution.
Yeah.
The risk is assuming that it's just the way things are, that it's human, that we do things because that's what human nature is, that that our understanding of what is the right thing to do is inherent within us, that there's a kind of inherent morality. But it's not just in the dimension of morals or ethics. It's the way that we comprehend society. It's the way that we understand sexuality. It's the way that we understand gender. It's almost every aspect of our lives is shaped by the weathering effects of Christianity. So that even concepts that seem to come from a pre-Christian period, we interpret them through a Christian prism. So we are here, I have my back to the Houses of Parliament, so I shouldn't really turn. My voice faded away because I was turning to look at the Houses of Parliament then. They're behind us.
Yes.
So we're in the heart of democracy. And everyone knows that democracy is a Greek word, that it goes back to ancient Athens. And it's conventionally translated, people power. The people have power. People have kratos. But, and that was kind of my assumption when I came to write about the democracy in ancient Athens, in Persian Fire. But it was one of the first times where I really felt, actually, my ability to understand what was going on. So I was writing about how democracy emerges in Athens. And I realized that my gut assumptions about what a democracy was were deeply flawed and deeply Christian. Because I think that we have the idea that democracy is about rights. People have the right to a vote. And so whenever people say about Athenian democracy, they'll say, yes, the freeborn males in Athens had the vote, but women didn't, slaves didn't, foreigners didn't. And the assumption is that this somehow invalidates the democracy that Athens had. It's measured by our standards in the 21st century and found wanting.
Sure.
But actually, that's not what the demos means. The people is a very, very weak translation of demos. Demos is the totality of people who have sprung from the soil of Attica. I mean, and the Athenians meant this literally. They saw themselves as literally emerging from the earth, the sacred soil of Attica, and it was the people who were living in Athens, but it was also the people who had gone before them and the people who were to come. So it was an inherently supernatural idea, and it was about the idea that the earth of Attica was sacred to the gods and specifically to Athena, who gave her name to the city in which they lived, and that the people have power because in some way that is the best way to preserve the favor of the gods and secure their protection over the city. And so men have the vote because it's their responsibility to construct laws that will enable the functioning of the city in the here and now. But equally important is to keep the gods on board, and that preeminently is the role that women have. So in the great festivals that the Athenians hold, of which the most celebrated, because it's portrayed on the Parthenon friezes in the British Museum, when the Panathenea, when a great celebration goes up to the Acropolis, it's led by women, and it's women who play the key role. And to our way of thinking, this seems a scam. Men have hoovered up the vote. They do all the practical things. Women are kind of fobbed off with weaving a robe for Athena and taking it up to the Acropolis. But that's not how they saw it. No. And we have to we have to kind of blank out the idea that this is about rights, because that is a kind of a Christian assumption that would have made no sense in the Athenian democracy. So that's an example of the kind of thing that made me interested in writing about Christianity, and made me conscious of the degree to which all of us in the here and now are shaped by it.
And so to that extent, to the degree that we now conceive of democracy as very much being about rights and human rights, it's more comes from the Christian tradition than from the Athenian one.
Yes, and so the temptation is to say our democracy is, we derive it from ancient Athens. We don't.
Right.
I mean, it's to say we use that word because it's something that the word democracy is taken up, it's written about by Aristotle, it's written about by Cicero. These are texts that pass into the mainstream of European intellectual discourse. And so people in universities are studying these texts, and people are familiar with Greek words like democracy, aristocracy, monarchy, and so on as types of government. But the people who are doing this, people who are studying it in universities, Aristotle and Cicero, are Christians. Yeah. And so they're colouring it with their assumptions, and we have inherited that.
And as you sort of dove, in a sense, yourself into that ancient world of Greece and Rome and so on, you obviously tell the story in Dominion how those preconceptions you had began to be challenged, and you, as it were, in all kinds of areas, started to see the ways in which the Western world is so very different to the values and traditions and everything else, and started to put together the pieces that so many of these seem to actually, that the change seemed to be at that point where Christianity arose in the Middle East.
Again, yes, essentially everything changes with Christianity, I think. And when I say everything, I mean everything within countries that have been Christian for centuries, millennia. Mm-hmm. But having said that, I also think that the influence of Christianity on the world more generally has been profound too. But particularly in a country like Britain that has been Christian for a millennium and more, the saturating effects are so profound that we don't recognise them. And that's not surprising. I mean, it's only to be expected.
And yet that thing you said about the assumption that, well, hey, we're all humans, there is this sort of innate human morality, that you find that all the time today. I mean, the British Humanist Association is essentially, that is its core doctrine. We don't need Christianity, we don't need anything, we just need to recognise our common humanity. So what do you say to those folk when they sort of say, hang on a minute, Tom, it's not all down to Christianity?
I think that that the modern West is unique in its cultural arrogance, in its assumption that its beliefs are universal, that everyone shares in them, and that if they don't, then they should. There's no sense that they're culturally contingent. Most people in the past were aware of that, but we are uniquely arrogant, and the reason for that is complicated and very much tied up with the emergence and history of Christian theology. And essentially, what we have as a result of the distinctive emergence of theological concepts in Latin Christendom is an idea that the world can be divided into two dimensions, the dimension of the secular and a dimension that we call religion. So the idea that there is something called religion that is separate from everything else in society is a distinctively Western one that is theologically determined. And again, this is something that I became very, very aware of when writing about, say, the Romans or the Greeks. If you think of, say, an introduction to ancient Greece, there will probably be a chapter on religion, Greek religion, and it will tell you the story of the gods, and there'll be something about priests and temples and cults, and then there might be something about the family or the city or warfare or agriculture or something like that, as though there is a dimension that can be of the supernatural that can be separated off from that, but it can't, because for the Greeks, the dimension of the supernatural and the dimension of the natural are as interfused as gin and tonic are in gin and tonic. They can't be kind of separated out like that. Whereas we do have that assumption. And in a way, it's a brilliant way for us to proselytize our values, because although it's bred of Christian theology, it's kind of ended up cannibalizing institutional Christianity. In a sense, the conceit of the West is that it's transcended Christianity to become purely universal, purely global, and therefore it can market itself in those terms. But its values, its assumptions, its ethics remain palpably bred of the marrow of Christianity. And I think that we've been able to get away with this conceit for as long as we have done, because we're the products of societies that for 200 or 300 years have been globally hegemonic. But as that ends, as the West's economic, financial, military, cultural power recedes, so I think our ability to assume that our values, our assumptions are universal will go into retreat as well.
Yeah, when we don't have the power, in a sense, to say to China, you have to adopt these human rights.
Right, so human rights is an absolutely classic example. People talk about universal human rights. Now, universal, what is universal? Universal, it means, in Greek is Catholic. So what we're talking about is Catholic human rights. People never put, don't translate it in that, but that's what we're talking about. It's so instinctive that we don't even recognize that. And human rights are Catholic in the sense of that they emerge as a coherent philosophical idea in the 12th century in the emergent universities of the Latin West. And our assumption that they are somehow, they float in the ether, that they are things that are just there, is as, it's as far-fetched as believing in angels or the Trinity or anything. I mean, it's absolutely a theological concept. But whereas the Trinity or angels are clearly Christian categories, Christian concepts, Christian myths, if you want, and have to be accepted as such, they can't escape their Christian character. The idea of human rights can. And so people can say everyone should have this understanding of human rights. They can
separate the gin and the tonic.
Yes.
Do you think so? Another guest on this series, Graham Tomlin, he's also sort of the captain of the Seen and Unseen ship. And his line that he pulls out a lot is that society is infinitely worse off if there's no overarching story. And I think, seeing as he's a bishop in the Church of England, he'd be very comfortable in being explicit of the Christian story. But I think my question then, what have we lost in separating the gin from the tonic? What have we lost in trying to secularize what you say are theological concepts that haven't just appeared in a vacuum? Do you think there's been a loss there, or do you think it's okay to sort of squeeze the juice out of the lemon and then discard the lemon?
Well, I quite like living in a secular state.
Yeah.
I think it serves the interests of a multi-faith society pretty well.
Yeah.
But the problem is, I think, that it requires not looking at the foundations, the kind of ideological underpinnings of secularism too closely. Because if you do that, you realize that actually it is still, it's not neutral. The conceit of secularism is that the secular state is neutral and can be neutral between religions, but it can't, because it's inherently biased towards a Christian perspective. And it requires other ways of comprehending the dimension of the supernatural to conform to a Christian shape. Because, say, a Muslim in Britain has freedom of religion.
Yes.
But inherent in that idea that there's freedom of religion is that Islam is a religion. Yeah. But if the category of a religion that is something distinct from a secular space is Christian, then it requires Islam in Britain to become that much more Christian, to shape itself to a kind of Christian understanding, basically to become a religion. And that, that may be fine, but I think it does generate all kinds of stresses and tensions that that we've seen over the past few decades, that it imposes demands on Muslims that can make Islam a kind of uncomfortable bedfellow for secularism, as you would expect, because it's the height of arrogance to assume that a civilization that is just as complex and rich and sophisticated as Christian civilization. Basically, the conceit of secularism is that the whole of Islam can be brought into the big tent. But can it?
That's I suppose that's a big question. I mean, I'd love to come back to the fruits of Christianity and whether they can exist without the roots and so on. But I'm aware that we're sitting, just outside Parliament. Westminster Abbey, where the coronation will be taking place soon, is there. I'm sure you'll be covering this in The Rest is History and lots of other ways. But obviously, the monarchy and European monarchies have always obviously had this very close relationship, very often with Christianity, Christendom, a checkered relationship in many ways. And in your own book, you're very clear about the good and the bad, as it were, in that history.
Well, but also that our understanding of what is good and bad is
fundamentally shaped by a Christian outlook. Exactly. So, what's your give us, if you would, a quick primer on the way in which what we're going to be seeing in the coronation of King Charles is sort of prefigured, in a sense, by Christian history. I mean, I know that in that ceremony itself, there's going to be a lot of stuff which a lot of people might be quite surprised by, given the last one was 70 plus years ago. About just how Christian and how much relevance there'll be to the Old Testament and all that sort of thing.
It's an incredibly Christian ritual.
Yeah.
And the coronation ritual takes us back to the early years of Christianity in England. So the coronation ritual that the king will be using, in its essence, goes back to the time of Edgar in the 10th century. And it was composed for him by St. Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, while he was supposedly working as a blacksmith. The devil came in and he reached for the tongs and took the devil with the tongs on Wonderful. The nose.
Yeah.
So it takes us back to a dimension where stories like these are being told of archbishops. I don't think Justin Welby has attacked
I haven't heard
the devil with a pair of tongs
of that happening, but you never know.
So that's taking us back, but it goes back further than that, because the idea that that kings should be anointed is one that actually in the West seems to originate in Visigothic Spain before the Muslim invasions of Spain. Tradition says that it goes back to Clovis, who was the first king of the Franks, to be baptized into the Catholic faith. And it says the story is that the ampulla is the holy oil is brought down to him. But the idea of kings being anointed, of course, goes back to the Old Testament. It goes back to Saul and David and Solomon. So it's a fantastically ancient ritual. I mean, we're going right the way back to Bronze Age Israel.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that it's taking place in one of the great cities of the modern world is fantastic. And kind of unique, because in medieval Europe there were only 4 monarchs that were anointed. So that was the King of England, King of France, King of Jerusalem, King of Sicily. King of England's the only one that's still around.
Right. The last, in a sense, explicitly Christian symbolism, as it were, in a coronation service. Then, I mean, what's your feeling about? Obviously, the king's predecessor, Queen Elizabeth II, had a deeply held faith. And one gets the sense that at her coronation in 1952, there was a real sense of that she really did take this as a divine mandate.
It's
on
a sacrament.
A sacrament, exactly. As obviously, presumably, many generations of monarchs before her did. You don't know exactly what King Charles thinks of his, this perspective, but one wonders almost how long that idea can even survive in modern 21st century
It's a very
Britain.
interesting one. I mean, I wonder whether this will be the last. I think Charles probably does take it seriously. He seems mystically inclined. Whether William, I mean, William doesn't seem. I don't really know enough what William thinks, but he doesn't seem.
Well,
Maybe he does. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, who knows? I don't know. But I think for anyone with a sense of with an interest in history, it will be an amazing thing. I mean, it is like seeing a kind of dinosaur or something. Yeah, still alive in a zoo or something. I mean, I think it's interesting because when the Queen died, the rituals of mourning were very Christian.
Yes,
and I think lots of people were surprised by how moving they found that, and enjoyed the sense of sacrality and weirdness that they suddenly found were manifest at the very heart of the fabric of the British state. Of course, there were lots of people who hated it, and essentially whether you find whether you enjoy the fact that Bronze Age rituals have been conducted to mark the passing and the hailing of your head of state or not. I mean, that's a very much a temperamental thing. I love it. I think it's great, but I can understand why people who don't want to have kind of this degree of weirdness at the heart of things would find it annoying.
I think that's what I'm intrigued about is, the goldfish in the goldfish bowl is how people will respond when they're told they're in the goldfish bowl. I'm really intrigued about that.
The coronation absolutely is a kind of, oh, look, we're in a goldfish bowl
kind
of moment.
You suddenly notice the water you're swimming in.
What have been... I'm assuming you might have a little bit of insight because how have people responded to, but this idea that human rights and all of these things does that annoy certain, your atheist friends, for example? How do people respond to the fishbowl?
I'd written an earlier book, In the Shadow of the Sword, about late antiquity and the relationship of empire and monotheism in late antiquity, so Zoroastrianism and the Persian Empire and Christianity and the Roman Empire, and then of course Islam and the Arab Empire. And the argument in that was that the stories Muslims tell about the emergence of Islam, whether it's how the Quran came to be composed or who Muhammad was and the early years of the empire that his followers are said to have founded, that a lot of this was mythical, that the sources for it are too late to be taken as literally telling us what happened. And this generated quite a lot of controversy, and I made a film about it as well that went out on Channel 4 that obviously had a much larger audience than a book, and generated quite a lot of
I love your British understatement here. If you're about to say generated a little bit of controversy, I mean, the odd
it generated
threat.
a lot of death threats.
Yes,
let's put it like that.
Yeah.
And I was supported by lots of atheists, humanists, rallied to the cause, and I was incredibly grateful for their support. And I think probably some of those people who rallied to my cause do feel that I've slightly slapped them in the back by telling them basically that they're all Christian. But what can you do?
Prank.
What can you do? And one of the things that prompted that steeled me to write Dominion was that when I was giving a talk about In the Shadow of the Sword, there was a Muslim in the audience who said, "How can you do this? How could you do this? You would never do this to your own beliefs." And I felt the force of what she was saying because it had already begun to trouble me. Exactly that, because I realized that I was not being neutral when I wrote about Islam, the beginnings of Islam, because I'm not a Muslim. There's not a position of neutrality where I can stand outside. I am as party pre as the most committed Muslim on this. My perspective, because not believing that the Quran comes from God is as much a faith position as believing that it does. So I was kind of aware of that. And I was also aware, I was already kind of thinking about, well, where do my assumptions come from? And feeling that the kind of the Enlightenment perspective, which rather unthinkingly I'd had since my teenage years, when I'd read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and Byron said of him that he sapped a solemn creed with solemn sneer, and I liked his solemn sneer, and kind of and felt myself to be on its side, but I was coming to realize that my kind of default assumption that my values, beliefs, perspectives derived from the Enlightenment were deeply inadequate. And so essentially I wrote Dominion to do to my beliefs kind of what I'd done to Islam in the Shadow of the Sword, i.e. to deconstruct them, to stress test them, to see, well, are the myths that I have been brought up to believe, are they actually true? What is the Enlightenment something that banishes Christianity, that kind of supersedes it, that triumphs over it, or are its myths themselves essentially Christian? And the whole idea, the very word Enlightenment, the idea that people have walked in darkness and are being brought into light, the idea that superstition is something to be banished, the idea that the idols that people worship must be toppled. I mean, this is clearly a very Protestant thing. It's the debt that the Enlightenment owes to the Reformation. Once you see it, you can't forget it. Yeah. But equally, the conceit of the Reformation, that it is somehow a radical break. I mean, in one sense, of course, it is. But the Reformers are doing nothing that missionaries in the early Middle Ages weren't doing. They also were bringing people into the light as they saw it, toppling idols, banishing superstition. And that in turn, of course, is drawing on things that go back ultimately to prophets of the Old Testament. The idea that the gods of Egypt and Babylon are nothing but stock and stone. So that, I of course, telling my humanist friends that they were basically, they were a kind of end point in the history of Protestantism. Lots of them were annoyed. But I've got to say it for humanists, they're much less prone to issuing death threats than...
Yes. They get angry on Twitter, but that's you can cope with that.
Yeah, but it's kind of very Church of England form of anger. I'm really cross.
I'm thinking about sort of what Nietzsche said. If I butcher this, apologies, but we're living in the shadow of the corpse of God. And what would you say to, obviously you're a historian, but going forward, do you see that maybe as we do all sort of start to realise that we're in the fishbowl? So it's a great metaphor to cling on to, that one. I see why it's your cliche that you open things with.
Well, cliches are cliches because,
exactly.
they work.
Yeah, dead right. Do you see us wanting to keep the fruits without the roots?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Nietzsche was particularly contemptuous of British liberals.
Okay.
I mean, even when he's writing in the late 19th century, he preserves his particular scorn for British liberals, who he singles out that they want to keep the fruits of Christianity while banishing everything that the tree. And I think that's if he came and took a temperature check on the intellectual state of Britain now, he would be even more contemptuous probably, because at least back in the 19th century, British agnostics understood the context from which they were emerging. I mean, they were deeply, deeply familiar with the Bible and Christian doctrine, whereas now most people aren't. Yeah. But I think more broadly, Nietzsche's perspective at the end of the 19th century was that the death of God was bound to create times of fearsome convulsion, kind of age of blood. Okay. And of course he was absolutely right, because effectively what he was prophesying was the emergence of fascism.
Sure.
And I think that what Nietzsche didn't see, well, maybe he did actually. So I think that fascism has slightly rebooted the Christian inheritance because it's given us a new mythology. So people now in the West, by and large, are not familiar with the Christian myths of heaven and hell, of angels and demons.
Sure.
But we have a new mythology that essentially has taken the place of that earlier Christian mythology, because instead of demons, we have Nazis. Instead of the devil, we have Hitler. Instead of hell, we have Auschwitz. And why did the Nazis play that role? Basically because they, unlike, say, the French revolutionaries or the Russian revolutionaries, who certainly targeted institutional Christianity, but didn't target the fundamentals of Christianity, the moral fundamentals of Christianity, namely the idea that there is a kind of universal human dignity, sure, and the idea that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. Yeah. The Nazis basically repudiated both those ideas. Yeah. They absolutely felt that there isn't a universal human dignity, that that Greek and Jew are not one. Yeah. That there are different races, and that and that one race should triumph over the other. Yeah. And absolutely that there should be survival of the fittest, which in turn means that you not only have the right, but you have the moral duty to kind of dispose of the weak.
Fittest. Yeah.
I mean that's the moral good.
Okay.
And that, I think, was seen as so shocking by people because it is such a conscious repudiation of the Christian inheritance. So the Nazis serve us as these, as the model for evil and depravity, because they offended our Christian values, and so they give us an ersatz Christian myth. And if you think of Nietzsche's parable of the death of God lying in the cave, that corpse casting shadows. Yeah. So it's a kind of riff on Plato. Yeah. Those our obsession with Hitler, our determination to call anyone we disagree with a Nazi, is a flickering of the shadow of the corpse of God, I think. But if that's so, then it leaves open the question: how sustainable is that mythology as the memory of the Second World War and the Nazi period fades? Is that mythology strong enough to maintain our values in the way that historically Christianity has been?
I sometimes wonder, though, as well, whether when atrocities happen, and even in more recent past, when Putin invades Ukraine and so on, and people are suddenly brought up to the fact that evil exists, it turns out we're not all heading towards this beautiful humanist paradise where everyone will just realise we should all be a brotherhood of man and live in harmony together in a sort of godless utopia. That sort of the trajectory doesn't always bend towards justice, as Martin Luther King said. And does that in itself perhaps cause people to go back and ask, is the kind of humanist doctrine of, well, we're all going to keep getting better as we just get to more knowledgeable and more technology?
I would have thought so. I mean, I don't
could that point them back to the Christian story? I don't know.
I would have thought it would, because essentially it's a supernatural faith that things are, that the universe has a purpose. That what was it? The
moral arc of the universe
bends towards justice.
Bends towards justice. Yes,
I mean, that's obviously nonsense if you don't believe in a supernatural dimension.
And it was obviously stated by a clergyman, Martin Luther King.
Yeah. But I think it's not just that the idea that humans have an inherent value is plainly a theological assumption, something that can only be underpinned by a sense of faith. I mean, it's not objectively true scientifically. There's no way in which science can demonstrate that is true. But I think also there's the sense that actually that our kind of post-Christian ideology, humanist ideology, secular, liberal, whatever you want to call it, progressive ideology, is actually rather anemic and rather boring.
Right.
And that's why again Hitler is so important, because the Nazis have the kind of malign glamour that devils have in Christian mythology, and it makes it kind of exciting. It dramatizes the story. It illustrates the kind of the moral teachings that we hold to in our society in the most dramatic manner possible. And that's why I think that it's such a mistake for the churches to kind of try and blend themselves into the kind of the dominant secular take, because I think that without the Christian story, Christianity itself comes to seem pallid. The drama, the excitement, the inherent quality, these are, it's called the greatest story ever told. It is the greatest, in terms of its measurable impact on the history of the world, it's plainly the greatest story ever told. The biblical narratives, the sense of a mythology that Christianity has always been rooted in. And abandoning that or not emphasizing it, not foregrounding it, seems to me a terrible mistake on the part of the churches.
Or apologizing for it. I've heard you say this before, that you want, in a sense, if the church's story is to remain foregrounded, it needs to keep Christianity weird. It doesn't want to be just another sort of public service provider, in line with the NHS and civil service or anything like that.
Well, but I think that what Christianity can do is to dramatize our values and our ideals for us.
Yes.
And if Christianity doesn't do it, then we don't apart from the kind of the Nazis, we don't really have a dramatic story that carries it and conveys it. And I think part of what is happening, say in America at the moment, is that people are looking around for alternative stories that can illustrate the values that they want to tell. So that's why Black Lives Matter was so fascinating from that point of view, was that the story of George Floyd, an innocent man put to death by the apparatus of a superpower. Why did the power of that clearly drew on the fact that at the heart of Western civilization for 1,000 years and more, we have had the figure of an innocent man put to death by the security apparatus of a superpower. And the martyrdom of George Floyd, which is how it was portrayed, has its cultural power on the fact that we as a society in Europe and America are culturally attuned to finding that stirring and moving and powerful. But we do that because of the story of the Passion, ultimately. And if our society does not have a familiarity with that story, then ultimately our ability to find the idea of an innocent poor man being put to death by the powerful, that capacity will fade, I think, over the course of decades, perhaps centuries.
Can I ask a question that is in danger of feeling simplistic, but I think the obvious question to ask, you've said I can't remember what podcast I heard you say, or maybe you've said it a few times, but the death charge of Jesus reverberated out and out and out and is still doing so. And you've just given a really tangible example in the killing of George Floyd. A really simple question, but that I think if I was listening to this podcast, I just want you to touch on is why? What about that story? What about that particular death charge? What about the way that, why the reverberations? And what about the earlier reverberations that were powerful enough that we're still feeling them now?
I think if you look at the way that the ideas that are are framed in the Hebrew scriptures as starting to influence the Roman world.
Okay.
There's clearly a fascination with them. And I think it's a reflection of the fact that living in the Roman Empire, it's possible to have a sense of the whole of humanity. That's the Roman conceit. But you're living in a single global order. It's possible to imagine a world in which everybody has a kind of common humanity. And the Hebrew scriptures are the most kind of the most intellectually rich way of framing that. The idea that there is, a God who has created everything and created all human beings in his image is one that I think people across the Roman Empire are starting to find quite interesting. But that's counterset against the fact that this is a Judean God. So the role, how does this Judean God relate to Greeks or Romans or whatever, Egyptians? And the genius of the message that's preached by Paul is to come up with an answer to that, to say that there is a new covenant, and that it is somehow tied in with the fact that Christ has died for everybody, and therefore everybody can be bound by this new covenant. And by placing the idea that it's weakness that has triumphed over the strong, it's like it's like one of those kind of lightning flashes that people sometimes say kind of generated life. It's a wholly unexpected development that proves unbelievably fruitful.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it works because it chimes with something very profound in human nature, but it hadn't really been tried in that way before.
Okay.
I mean, that in a sense is, a brilliant objective historical answer essentially to why the revolution took hold. In the last few minutes that we've got with you, Tom, I suppose I wanted to move it from Tom Holland, the objective historian, to Tom Holland, the personal person, and what you do, what you've been feeling with as this Christian story intellectually has obviously you've realised the power and impact of it and so on. I know that you pop into the odd church, you darken the doorway of the odd building. Has this kind of gone alongside a sort of personal kind of spiritual journey?
Well, so I still believe that in the liberal values that I had.
Yes.
Well, instinctively I believe in them. Objectively, I don't. If I'm being purely absolutely pitiless with myself,
the pure rationalist,
I stand on a kind of Nietzschean abyss where basically I can't believe anything that I want to believe. I feel the underpinnings have been taken away. So in that sense, it's quite a kind of Victorian crisis of faith. Yes. Matthew Arnold, I mean, they were all, George Eliot, they were kind of feeling this as well in a way. But I do still believe in them. I do still think that every human being has a dignity. I do think that that strength isn't the measure of value. And I think that I recognize these as being not scientific, not being objective, but as being bred of a distinctive cultural and theological tradition that is all around me, that is part of my inheritance. It's very, very easy for me to read the Bible, go to a church, listen to what Christians are saying, read the great masterpieces of Christian literature, and feel moved by it, and feel that I am a part of what they're talking about. And sometimes I can feel that this is more for me than just a kind of an exercise in cultural tourism. Sometimes I can feel, I can believe that the spirit is real. I can believe that the story of the Passion and the Resurrection is so strange that it's not just a kind of cultural accident, that perhaps it is expressive of something that is true. And there are other times where I just think, no, it's all complete nonsense. We are just we're just animals. We'll probably all be wiped out by an asteroid at some point, or we'll
go the way of the dinosaurs.
Yeah, we'll go the way of the dinosaurs. It'll all be. And I suppose it's a bit like when you're first trying to ride a bike, that you can find yourself, wow, I'm riding a bike, and then you think, and then you fall off, and it varies on my mood. It varies on the time of the year. It varies on how hard I think about what it is that I'm doing.
Yes.
But I suspect that I'm not unusual in that, actually.
I would agree. I think your experience is probably shared by so many, but there's a sense in which inevitably faith has always been something where you to some extent do have to do that Kierkegaardian sort of leap of faith of saying, okay, I can only, my reason and logic can only take me so far, and at this point I am sort of going on a sense of my gut instinct, that the way I want life to be, almost.
But I tell you, when I feel it least, is when I hear Christians talking about Christianity as though it's just something that can be entirely blended in seamlessly with the broader pattern of the secular world. Then I just despise it and think there's no point in it, and grow up
like everything else.
Yeah. But when I when I visit I don't know, so I've just been to Kent, exploring pre-Norman conquest Kent, and I went to St. Martin's, on the outskirts of Canterbury, which is the church that Bertha, who was the Frankish queen of Athelbert of Kent, who receives Augustine, first of the archbishops of Canterbury, and she'd been given this place that seems to have been a Roman mausoleum. So you stand in that place, and you are not only going back to the beginnings of continuous Christianity in the English-speaking world in that space, but you're also going back beyond that to the last days of the Roman Empire, and a sense of the strangeness there. Then I completely felt it. I felt the kind of spirit rush, the flame, and maybe it's just that my sensibility is very. I feel moved by antiquity, perhaps. But Christianity is an ancient religion. Yes. And that antiquity, it's written through time. That's the whole point of it. Yeah. Augustine talks of the church as being on a pilgrim church going through time. So the fact that Christianity is situated in time, in history, is important. And I personally, I find that very moving, and so that's why I'm aware that there will be lots of Christians listening to this who will say, this is all a bit papist. When I say Christian, I mean evangelicals, perhaps, who were saying this is a bit papist, the idea that particular spaces can have a sacrality. But since this podcast is called Re-Sacralize, is it Re-Sacralize?
Re-enchanting.
Re-enchanting.
That would be a great alternative title for it, and one of your own favourite terms.
I crave the enchantment.
Yes.
And I think a Christianity that has bled itself of enchantment is a pallid and an anemic thing.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Perfect place to end.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Gosh, it's been an absolute joy to talk with you, Tom. Thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And yes, we'll be back again next time with another guest.
Once I put my mind back together, I think. Thank you so much, Tom.
Thank you, Tom.
Pleasure.